Hello, my name is David Charles Rowan, and I've been a teacher of astrology and a practicing astrologer since 1991. And over the years, I've found that while many people are aware of their sun sign, or what media columnists call their star sign, not everyone is aware of their personal astrological birth chart, or even familiar with the notion of what a personal astrological birth chart is. So it's the purpose of this video to introduce you to the astrological chart and also to some of the dynamics of perhaps a deeper astrology than you may yet have encountered. And most people meet astrology in media and magazines. And as we know, all human skills and endeavours have a range of competence, from mastery at one end to, well, incompetence at the other. So if we were going to use musical genres as a scale of sophistication in astrology, we might say that there is an X Factor or American Idol at one end and Beethoven at the other, with perhaps a Led Zeppelin or Gilbert and Sullivan in the middle. So it's the hope of this video to aspire towards the Beethoven end. And in the spirit of heading towards the Beethoven end of astrology, we're going to begin with looking at an astrological chart. Now, to avoid any issues of confidentiality or ethics, I'm going to use my personal birth chart so that I'm not treading on anyone's toes, whether they're alive or they've departed from the world. And you'll notice that the birth chart I'm about to show you is slightly different to the one you can see in the top right-hand corner of this image. And that's because the chart in the top right-hand corner of this image is my self-employed chart that was constructed the moment I became fully self-employed. And we'll meet that one again a little bit later in one of the illustrations. But first, this is my personal astrological birth chart. And within this black rectangle, you can see that there are two objects. There's a round thing and a triangle thing. And we're going to start with the round thing. And when people look at one of these things for the first time, usually they just confuse with an array or a cacophony of wiggles and squiggles. I guess that's really because it is a cacophony of wiggles and squiggles, but all these wiggles and squiggles hold meaning to an astrologer. And the easiest way to make sense of it is to see it as a series of circles inside circles inside circles. So we'll start with the outside ring. So here you can see all 12 signs of the zodiac. Everybody has all 12 signs of the zodiac in their personal astrological birth chart. And this is our first departure from what you might find in certain periodicals, because there are two zodiacs. You're obviously familiar with star constellations, you know, like Gemini or Libra, for example. But what we're looking at here is not the celestial or sidereal zodiac, but rather what's called the tropical zodiac. And this is my birth chart again. And if you look in the top left-hand corner, you can see it's got my name. I've deleted all the other information, but I've allowed the word topical to still show. So the tropical zodiac, what is that? Well, this zodiac doesn't exist. I know. All the star columns and things you see, they're talking about a zodiac that isn't there. There isn't a zodiac that circumvents the Earth. Through your life, you've never heard, you know, on the news, people say things like, yes, it's just been confirmed that Shuttle Challenger is going to lift off and blast the hole through Sagittarius, or, you know, one of the kind of X-rockets is going to come back down and make a hole through Taurus. No, that doesn't happen because it isn't there. The tropical zodiac describes the Earth's relationship with the sun. So just to borrow some imagery from NASA, this is from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. You're obviously familiar with the notion that the Earth, as it orbits the sun in its elliptical orbit, also does so on a slant. the Earth's axis leans over. And this means that at certain times of the year, various regions of the Earth will be exposed to more or less light. So if we look at the extremes of those, then from the longest day of the year to the shortest day of the year, we would divide those things into two sets of summer and winter. And there is a point in between where the hours of daylight are equal to the hours of nighttime. But when the hours of daylight are equal to the hours of nighttime, they feel different. You know, at one time of the year, when the hours of daylight and night are equal, it's still fairly early on in the year, and the air is still a bit cold after winter, but everything's green and going bushy. And the other time of the year, when the hours of daylight and nighttime are equal, you can still feel a bit of the warmth and warm air of summer, but everything's kind of orange and in a state of decay. So although at what's known as the equinoxes, the hours of daylight and nighttime are equal in terms of, you know, their ratio of hours and minutes, the feeling of them is quite different. And we could say that these four quadrants or seasons each have their own sense, but each one also has like the period of its beginning when a new season ushers its way in and then becomes established, you know, like it's obviously spring now, or it's obviously summer, or it's obviously winter. And then there's that kind of odd bit where you can't quite work out if it's the end of one season or the beginning of the next one. So in other words, each of these quadrants or seasons could be divided into subsets of 3, thus making 12 distinguishable qualities that we experience in the world around us as we orbit around the sun. And that is the tropical zodiac. And it's this that we use in horoscopic astrology. There are forms of astrology that look at stars and stars in the celestial sphere, but in horoscopic astrology, we use the tropical zodiac, and we're concerned with planets rather than stars. So, but let's have our local star as an idea. So here's the sun, and of course, what we experience in our daily lives is that the sun rises. So here you can see this white arrow on the left represents the eastern western horizon. And the other arrow pointing directly upwards represents the zenith, what's right above your head at that moment. And of course, if this is the horizon in the middle, then this other white line down here represents the other side of the world beneath your feet. And if you can imagine that as the sun rises, imagine the sun is going to go up, trace an arc over your head and dip down behind you. So if you followed it round, you'd find yourself sort of here. And in an astrological birth chart, if we draw all of the planets outside of the celestial sphere or outside of the tropical zodiac, then, and you know, if we looked at their distances, some of them would be a mile or two away, and you need a huge big bit of paper for that. So what we do is represent it symbolically by placing the image of the sun inside the wheel. And this is what it would look like in the context of an actual chart. Okay, but back to our tropical zodiac. So each one of these sections is the same size. They're all the same size, 30 degrees. Sometimes astrologers tell people you've got a lot of Virgo in your chart, or you've got a lot of Taurus in their chart. They haven't. They've got the same amount as everyone else. Everyone has 30 degrees of every sign. 360 divided by 12 gives you 30. When astrologers say you've got a lot of Taurus or Libra or Aries in your chart, what they mean is you have a lot of planets or a lot of focus in that area. But they're not necessarily using language correctly. But then that's not uncommon because we, you know, sometimes say that you've seen a beautiful sunrise or you've seen a beautiful sunset, but the sun doesn't rise and it doesn't set. Yes, I mean, subjectively, we experience the sun coming up like this. But what's really happening is that we are turning to the east like that. It doesn't feel like that. And if you attempt to feel it, you'll feel all wobbly. Don't do that. Stay on the ground, plant yourself on the subjective experience that you are in a stable rock. And it's the sphere around us that's moving rather than the other way around. But that's technically what's happening, right? So these signs of the zodiac, then, which are all the same size of 30 degrees, the symbols are usually drawn in the center of each regional zone. And some people mistakenly think that where the symbol is written, that's exactly where Leo is, or exactly where Cancer is, or exactly where Gemini is. But if we use Aries as an example, this is the symbol for Aries. There you can see Aries in the chart, in its zone or region. And that zone or region is comprised of 30 degrees, which begin at this end, at 0, and then end at 29 degrees, 59 minutes, 59 seconds. And in the very next second is 0 degrees of Taurus, and all the way around until you get the complete wheel. So signs of the zodiac for astrologers represent qualities like lenses of life. So a sign of zodiac represents the manner or style in which we do a certain thing. In the middle ring of a birth chart, there are other symbols. These are called planets. And planets represent behaviors, things that we do. So, as people, we create things, we destroy things, we go towards things, we run away from things. And you might say, hey, hold on a minute, Mr. Rowan, I can think of a lot more symbols than you've got in your chart. Well, in astrology, all of the symbols are polysemous, which means they have multiple layers of meaning. So it's not that a planet in a sign means a thing. It's a planet in a sign means this and all this and all this and all this and all this. And they describe a range of parameters or dynamics. And so a part of the astrologer's craft isn't to say, well, you've got that planet in that sign, that's it, you're stuck with it, like some kind of machinery of fate or destiny. No, rather than that, it allows us to describe to a person the options they have, whether conscious or unconscious, whether they know about them or they haven't yet discovered them, and then to help a person identify how they're using a particular part of their chart at the moment, and also how they might else use them, and then turn into a life coach and help them find ways or strategies to be able to bring out the parts of themselves that they wish to express in a certain way rather than the way it has been up to that point. So it can be a very useful tool of illumination and self-exploration. Yes. So planets. And so when we have a planet in a sign, it can look like this in an astrological birth chart. And you'll notice now that we have some data as well. The reason for this is, again, this is a symbolic representation, a symbolic map, as well as being a map of symbols. And so things have been drawn in a slightly exaggerated way, because technically each of these planets is only one dot in size, 1 degree. And yet if we just drew them as dots, we wouldn't be able to tell which is which. All we'd see is some dots. So whether a person is drawing a birth chart by hand, which is the way it used to be when I started, or a computer does it for us, the font, if you like, the glyph or the symbol of the planet is drawn larger than it actually is. But if you look at where my cursor is at the moment and go straight down, you'll see that there's what looks like a kind of purple number 4. And that's the symbol for the planet Jupiter. And when I was born, Jupiter was at 1 degree of Pisces, or in other words, it's right at the very beginning of the sign. But the symbol itself is drawn so wide, it probably occupies about 5 or 6 degrees. So a part of the blue symbol for Jupiter is hanging back into the previous sign of Aquarius, where that yellow symbol is. And most of the symbol of Jupiter is forwards into the blue symbol of Pisces. So in order to make sure when we look at it casually where it is in exactitude, the software writes just above the planet the degree that it is actually situated at. So in this case, it's at 1 degree. That is it of Pisces or is it in Aquarius? So just above that, just to reassure us, let us know what we're looking at. You can see there it says 1 degree Pisces and 17 minutes as well, which is helpful to an astrologer in the work. So we have planets in signs. Now, I would say, of course, that when you look at my planets in my chart, there are some other lines in here. We're going to come to those in a moment. But this is the symbol for the sun, a dot inside a circle. And when I was born, the sun is in Aries. And so a person might say, oh, if your sun sign is Aries, that means you're an Aries. But I'm not an Aries. The entire chart describes me. But something strange has happened in astrology that if it happened in a different discipline, it would seem very peculiar. You know, like, for example, if you go to the Natural History Museum or, you know, a natural history museum in the area where you live on planet Earth, and you look at the annals of zoology and genealogy, you won't find any reference to a creature called a Gemini or a Libra or an Aquarius. And that's because they don't exist. Now, the phrase I am a, or the phrase you are a, is an identity statement. And something strange has happened in the realm of astrology that if it happened in a different discipline, it would seem a little bit nuts, really. I just imagine that it happens in the field of anatomy and physiology. Right? So an anatomist comes up to you, says hello, you say hello, and they say, right, you have a shoulder. You go, oh, yes. And you have a kidney. You go, right, wondering where's this going? And then they say, and you have a toenail. You go, yeah, okay. Well, they say, they look at their clipboard and say, oh, well, you're a toenail. You go, what? They say, you're a toenail. What does that mean? And they look it up and they say, oh, it means you shuffle through life. And you go, oh, and then you accept it. And then you go up to other people and tell them, and say to somebody, hello, I'm a toenail. And they go, oh, I'm a shoulder. You go, what does that mean? They go, I carry a responsibility. You go, well, I shuffle through life. No way, no way would you accept someone trying to describe the beauty and sophistication of your anatomy and physiology by isolating one small part of it and saying that one small part represents you as a totality. That really would be nuts, but that's exactly what's happened in astrology. So in the professional Beethoven area of astrology, we look at the whole chart, and the whole chart describes the complex dynamics of a human being. Because as human beings, we have some of our thoughts are conscious, we're aware of them. Some of our thoughts are unconscious, we're not aware of them. We have beliefs, we have values. Sometimes they clash and they differ. Sometimes we have conscious agendas and other times we have unconscious agendas, and then we fight and tussle within ourselves. All human beings have complexity. So some people want astrology to be accurate, which is brilliant. Other people want astrology to be brief, which is impossible if you want it to be accurate. Because to describe something of complexity briefly must mean that you are leaving out information. And if you're leaving information out of a picture, you're going to get a distorted picture. So the only way you can get an accurate picture is to take into account all of the information. And that means exploring all of the complexity of oneself in order to know oneself well. And that might take time. But I would always say that such a task as exploring the self deserves time, because we are creatures of value, and it's important to know oneself well. If your goal, of course, is self-illumination or self-mastery. Now, since we're addressing some misconceptions about astrology, there's another one that I'd like to address before we continue on our journey of looking at the anatomy of the astrological chart. And that is the notion of influence, that planets have influence. What does this mean exactly? Now, this might seem like a tangent, but if you can follow it just for a moment, you'll see that it does have some merit. In this picture that we have at the center here, it's our solar system with our huge lump of explosions, the sun, this large lantern in the middle. And around it, you can see planets orbiting. There's our Earth here, perched between the Mars, which is too cold, and the Venus, which is too hot, in what astronomers call the Goldilocks zone. And far out in the outer stretches of the solar system, there's Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and I have included Pluto in here. I know it's been declassified in the realm of astrology to a dwarf planet, but in astrological terms, we still employ it for interpretation purposes. And if, say, for example, one wanted to plot the position of Pluto, then using a telescope, you know exactly where Pluto is positioned within the tropical zodiac. So you know at what sign and what degree it is. And then you might want to confer meaning to that if you transition from astronomy to astrology. So astronomy looks at the celestial sphere, or the universe, and writes down the data of what it finds, classifies things, it names things, it understands things. Astrologers look at that same universe and apply or attribute meaning to it. So if we want to attribute meaning to the position or location of Pluto, how does that meaning come about? Because if there was, say, for example, a radio signal on Pluto, say there's a radio broadcasting station and they start to play a record, by the time the radio signal reaches the Earth, Pluto has moved position, which means that it can't work in terms of there's the object. Now it has a meaning, because by the time the meaning reaches us, the object has moved. So the purpose of looking at the location and notating it becomes lost. If you look at astrology through Newtonian physics, linear physics, it doesn't work. There are no magic rays. They're indetectable. If you look at astrology through a different lens of frontier physics, like chaos theory or systems theory, you can start to find a mechanism, but that's for a conversation that I hold in my introduction courses, and we haven't got time for that completely here. But where this notion of influence came from, you might know, for example, that if you wanted to know the truth in, say, ancient Greece, you'd go to the temple at Delphi and consult the oracles. If you want to know the truth in 13th century Ipswich, you go to the wooden church and ask the bishop. But from about 1780 onwards, if you want to know the truth, you go to the laboratory, the science laboratory. And you may know that the word science comes from the Roman or Latin scientia, meaning knowledge. But in antiquity, scientia wasn't held in as high esteem as philosophy. And philosophy is a word that's comprised of two Greek words. Philo means love, and Sophia was a goddess of wisdom. So philosophia means literally the love of wisdom. And in the realm of purist philosophy, there are no truths, there are no absolutes, there are only ideas and notions. So just imagine that you're in an amphitheatre in ancient Greece, and there's people hanging around in bed sheets and togas, and in the middle of this amphitheatre there's a huge vase, and somebody writes on a piece of parchment, "The earth is at the centre of all things and the universe revolves around the earth," a geocentric solar system, and they put that in the vase. And somebody else writes on a piece of parchment, "The sun sits at the centre of the solar system and the earth revolves around it," and they put that in the vase. And somebody else writes on a piece of parchment, I don't know, every second Tuesday, your head turns into a donkey, and they put that in the vase. Now, as far as the people in that now space are concerned, everything in that vase has an equal value, including the donkey thing, right? And what starts to happen is that different ideas have their followers. And the more followers an idea has, the more prevalent it becomes. So, not quite like a social newsfeed, but sort of in that direction, right? Now, you might have heard through being at school and things that Copernicus was the first person who said that we have a heliocentric solar system, that the sun is at the center and planets, including us, revolve around it. But he wasn't the first person to say that. No, someone else said it long before him. In 270 BC, a man called Aristarchus of Samos, who came from the same place that Pythagoras came from, he stipulated or suggested that the Earth revolves around the sun. He also said that the Earth spins on its own axis, and he measured the size of the moon using shadows. About 100 years after him, in around 150 BC, there's a chap whose name begins with H that I can't pronounce. I'm dyslexic and I can't pronounce it. I'm not even going to try. But this chap estimated the circumference of the Earth, and he was only 100 miles out. Yeah, I did just say that. He estimated the circumference of the Earth. A human being in 150 BC was writing down that the Earth is round. But in that time of philosophy, that idea wasn't necessarily at the forefront of everyone's thinking. It was in the background. So Plato went with the idea of the geocentric solar system. And he said that the divine will, if you like, is beyond the realm of the stars. And beneath the realm of the stars, if you can imagine that the Earth is the center and you've got concentric rings, like rings on a tree going out. So the outer ring of planets is Saturn's ring, and then you have the ring of Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, and so forth, right? So they thought that the will of the divine kind of meets the realm of Saturn, or the ring of Saturn, gets adjusted by Saturn, modified by Jupiter, changed by Mars. And when you get to the sublunar world, where we are, it creates pressures. These pressures hit you on the head, pressures like lust or greed, and then they make you do things and change your behavior. And that was how they described the mechanism of influence. Now, Plato had a pupil called Aristotle, and Aristotle went with his teacher's ideas, and Aristotle had a pupil called Alexander, who became the Great. And where an army goes, it takes its philosophies with it, and you might have heard that, Alexander the Great overtook the entire known world at the time. That's Europe, India, the Middle East, bits of China, right? At one point, there were more than 100 Greek cities in the Middle East, including one at a place called Alexandria, or at least that's the Greek name for it. And in this place of Alexandria, they built a library that was so big it became known as the Great Library. Now, when I first heard of this, the Great Library, I thought it was like the local library where I grew up. No, this thing had like 9 floors and 7 spas in it, and it housed all known writings in the world of that moment. In other words, it was a storehouse of pagan wisdom. And when Constance became the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, he didn't like this big storehouse of pagan stuff on the other side of the water. So he dispatched his troops, led by one Julius Caesar, to burn it down, which they did. But not everything went up in flames. Some of the manuscripts were rescued. And the last curator of the Great Library was a man called Claudius Ptolemy. And around 100 AD, he wrote books like Tetrabiblos and Orgamast. And his writings were some of the things that were rescued. So these wisdoms went into the Islamic world. Their scholars started to embellish things and add to it. And then they started to get persecuted by their clergy because they were doing kind of non-Quranic studies, as it were. So then the information went underground again, and following crusade routes popped up in Europe and became sort of the great knowledge, the great writings. So for about 1500 years, Ptolemy's writings on astrology were the template. And if you were a student of astrology in, say, the medieval period or even in the Elizabethan era, you'd be a dutiful student and you'd look back at previous texts and previous works and study them, not realizing, of course, that what you're studying is Ptolemy's work. Or in other words, what you're studying is Aristotelian theology. Or in other words, what you're studying is the notion that astrology is causal, that planets cause things. Now, from the Neoplatonists, when more information about antiquity came into our understanding, there were other writings in Hellenistic Greece that became revealed around the 16th, 17th century, one of which was the Stoics' philosophy. And the Stoics didn't see astrology as an issue of causality. They saw it as a notion of correlation. So a modern idea might be, if you're driving through an unfamiliar city and you have a sat-nav in your car, the sat-nav doesn't build the city, of course. The city is built by the great planners before you arrive. The sat-nav, at least at the moment, isn't the agency. You are the agency. You choose how, if you move or not. You know, are you going to stay still or go forwards or backwards? Are you going to go left or right? The sat-nav doesn't drive the car at the moment. The sat-nav just describes the territory that you're moving through, and then we choose how we use that territory or that mapping system. So although the sat-nav correlates with the world around you, even then we don't necessarily have to follow it. We can choose how we want to use the information. So people who have studied astrology at an academic level, and I was lucky enough to be one of the first 6 people in the world to get a Master of Arts degree in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology. And in 2002, we began at Bath Spa, and it's now an online Master of Arts at Trinity St David's, run by the very brilliant Associate Professor of Astrology, Nick Campion. I would highly recommend looking into it. But discovering this information on the MA means that there are certain astrologers that have the view that astrology is a matter of correlation and not cause. But there are most non-academic astrologers that believe that planets have influence over our lives and things like this. So when you're looking at things on the internet or even on your bookshelf, be a bit sort of mindful as to what the philosophy of the writer or the philosophy of the astrologer online, and that will give you an idea of why they're saying what they're saying in the way that they're saying it. And I think it's important for you to know that there's more than one perspective. Okay, right, back to the chart. Yes, I mentioned that in the middle of the ring there are these kind of lines. We call them houses, and similar in a way to the way that the signs flow around the wheel. This is the first house, and you can see there's the beginning of the first house, which is the end of the 12th, and the end of the first house is the beginning or cusp of the second house. And then, of course, following on from that, the beginning of the second house is the ending of the first house, and the end of the second house is the beginning of the third house. And that follows all the way around until you get to number 12, and of course the end of the 12th is the beginning of the first. Now, the easiest way to think about houses is to imagine that there's going to be the play of your life, right? The life of you. And it's going to be held in your favorite theatre, and we get premiere tickets. So that means we can go and watch a rehearsal. So we get in a minibus, we go down to rehearsal, we go in the back door of the theatre, and there's this huge auditorium that's all been changed to suit our needs. This large, round, circular stage. And at the front of the circular stage is a superb actor who's playing the life of you. And behind the superb actor, there's your whole life in a higgledy-piggledy heap. And so there's an aeroplane wing sticking through a window, and an elephant in a pile of sand, and a motorbike in a bath. We think, hold on a minute, we can't make sense of this. Everything's in a higgledy-piggledy heap. But luckily, because we're in a theatre, some stage hands would come on, and they would divide the stage into sets. So there'd be a set for going to work, and a set for talking to friendly astrologers and a set for being at home, right? And as the actor who's playing you, the brilliant actor that's playing you, does different things through the day, they move from one set to another, to another, to another. And each set has its own tone, its own lighting, its own furniture, its own atmosphere. And strangely, the actor has a pair of perceptual glasses on that chameleon-like reflect what they find in each of these zones or regions. So in one set, there is hope, and everything goes really well in that area of life. They like doing that, those behaviours, they really like it. In another sector, though, there's the expectation that everything will be challenging and difficult and things go wrong. They try and avoid that area of life, but ultimately you can't, because you have to live a whole life. So the easiest way of making sense of this is just to imagine for a moment that these are sets on a stage, and around the outside of the stage you have footlights. So the footlights are the wheel of the zodiac, and the dynamics of the footlights shine into or illume each of these zones or sets or houses. So these aren't empty. This one has some Virgo in it with some Libra there. This one has some Scorpio in it with some Sagittarius there, and so on. And let's just orient in our usual birth chart kind of orientation. There we go. And now in the theatre, not only do we have our footlights around the outside, but we can add in some spotlights, planets. So the spotlights or the planets show points of focus, areas of specific interest with reference to the nature of the planet that's there. So for an astrologer then, a planet represents something that we do. The sign of the zodiac a planet is moving through at the time something begins, like the beginning of your life, for example, represents the manner or style in which that behavior is done. And the house position shows the area of life in which that behavior is most likely to manifest or be observed. So, in other words, there's what we do, how we do it, and where we do it. Planets, signs, and houses. Okay? Oh, now, in the middle, there were all those kind of lines starting about, weren't there? These things. These are, in astrology, they're called aspects. And aspects represent the angular relationships between the planets from the viewpoint of observation. So if someone was standing next to you with magic glasses on or a huge telescope at the moment that you took your very first breath, and they just looked at the celestial sphere, they'd notice that a planet is here, there's another one there, there's another one there. And they would be able to denote the angular relationships between them. Right? And that's what this shows here. Now, the angular relationships between the planets represent the relationships between parts of ourselves. So if a person's conscious mind is in harmony with their unconscious, that's the kind of person that says, right, I'm going to the gym 3 days a week, and they get there. But if another person who, say, their conscious mind is discordant with their unconscious, that's the kind of person that says, right, I'm going to the gym 3 days a week, and then they sit on a sofa and eat cake and biscuits. You'd have to draw this out on a piece of paper the size of a warehouse to be able to discern the difference between these lines. They're crammed too close together. So what we do is we represent these in the triangle shape that's on the left-hand side in the main picture. And you'll notice that inside the chart, for example, there are some green lines with squares in the middle of them, and in the rectangle, what's called the aspect grid, you can see the green squares in here. So within this chart, there are approximately 90 pieces of information within every astrological birth chart. So if it's possible to go into a local shop and find a book on your sun sign, that's just the sign that the sun is in. Now, if you could imagine multiplying that by 90, That's roughly how much information you can be gleaned or drawn from one of these astrological charts. And in my astrological life over the last 34 years, I found that when I am asked by somebody, could you please tell me everything you can see in my chart? In my very early days, it would take about 2 hours for me to tell someone everything that I could see. Now, it takes about 50 2-hour consultations for me to complete and finish that conversation. You know, I was walking in a local high street once, probably about 15 odd years ago now, and I bumped into one of my ex-students who I thought really should have known better in a way. And she said to me, hello, well, hello. And in our conversation, she said, oh, by the way, could you do a brief reading for my friend? And I said, yeah, sure. What do you mean? And she said, well, you know, just a couple of hours. It's a couple of hours. She said, yeah. I said, right, okay. All right, well, I'll leave out everything to do with her future. She said, no, I think she want that. Okay. All right, I'll leave out everything to do with relationships. I said, well, no, I think she want that. All right. Well, I'll leave out everything to do from the past that could discolor relationships. No, I think she want that. And this went on for a while, you know. And I said, look, you give me a list of what to leave out, and I'll do a brief reading for your friend. And she said, well, I can't decide what you should leave out. I said, no, neither can I. And so, because I have the ability to kind of discern so much from a chart, it means that I either have a choice of just scratching the surface, looking at things completely deeply, or piecing out sections and looking at certain parts of a person's life or parts of a person's chart and ignoring the rest in that moment. For example, most people, when they book up a reading with me, will book up a personal forecast. That takes a couple of hours as a Zoom session online. Other people want to look at the dynamics of their relationship life. So in astrology, we differentiate between romance and commitment, because you can have lots of commitment without any romance. You can have lots of romance without any commitment, right? They're not the same thing, right? So, but within the dynamics of human relating, there's also unconscious needs, because you could have a person who has a strong desire to be in a relationship, but an emotional need for space and freedom and independence. And you can't get close union and relationship in the same box. So a person with that kind of sense of themselves has to find a way of having connection and also space simultaneously, which isn't easy, especially in a society that expects everyone to be close. Yes. And then there's the psychological relationship with intimacy. You know, that's another dynamic again. So exploring specifically one's own relationship dynamics can be profoundly illuminating and very useful. So when people look at my website, you'll find that there's a listing of a different range of readings, among which one of my favorite ones to do is the life of a child for a parent. I think it's a beautiful thing to be able to show a parent the different chapters of how a person will unfold, and you know the direction that they could head in, because everything is in potentials. You know, yes, it's a very privileged thing to be able to do. The most profound thing I do, I call astrobiography, the reading of your life. And that's the one that takes about 50 consultations spread over 2 years. And it's like looking at a person in incredible detail, but also at the same time conducting therapy on every single part of their life that isn't functioning or flowing in the way that they wish it to. Because 34 years ago, when I started doing readings for people, I realized that this art, this toolkit of astrology, enables a person to be able to explore themselves at a very deep level. And some people have very challenging lives. And I realized very early that I need training. So I looked at different hypnotherapy courses, because I'd looked at hypnotherapy when I was about 20. And someone pointed me in the direction of a chap who was teaching an eclectic mix of NLP and hypnotherapy in a field called psychobiology, which looks at the relationship between language and physiology. So I trained with him, and then he retired and gave me the copyrights to his training material. And I've been teaching people to become therapists in what I call neuroholistic therapy. So when I do a life reading, it's part astrology, part therapy, which is one of the reasons why it can take so long to do. But it's a profound exploration. And that, my friends, is an introduction to an astrological birth chart. I hope you've enjoyed this perspective and a bit of a look into what is possible from a chart. A little bit more perhaps than you might find from a media column, but also some ideas within this that astrology might be different to what one may assume or think that it is. Some people say that astrology is a science or a pseudoscience. I would say it's neither of those things, because when you consider the notion of scientific method, astrology just does not meet that. It's not a science, it's an art. And like all arts, it's really the quality of it depends on the quality of the artist. So in the same way that you could have 10 violinists and you give each violinist the manuscript or the dots of Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and they all interpret the dots in their own way, even though they're all reading from the same manuscript. But it's Kennedy's interpretation that gets the round of applause. So likewise, you could have 10 astrologers all looking at the same chart, and the style of interpretation will differ from astrologer to astrologer. There might be some common ground between them, but there'll also be some variation as well. So like any artist, it's really a question of finding one that does it the way that you like. If you happen to like any of the way that I do things, this is my basic information here, and you're very welcome to contact me at the rowan.astrology.com and have a look at the different readings and things on offer. If you have any questions, you can contact. I teach as well. I teach an introduction course to astrology, but also there's professional training as well for those that want to dive deeper into the nature of the human condition. Thank you so much indeed for your time in watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you. Take care.